Thanks very much, Neil, and I hope everybody can hear me. This is very much a new venture for me. I've never given a talk online to a conference, and to make matters worse, Neil's just told everybody that I've got to make it interesting. So my apologies to those who don't find the subject of slugs interesting. However, Emily Forbes and myself were asked to say a few words about a research program which we've been conducting on sustainable slug control. The concept is fairly straightforward. Slugs are generally not evenly distributed, of course, across arable fields, but exist in patches with higher slug densities, which exist within kind of a sea of lower slug numbers. We've been testing whether we can reduce the use of slug pellets by targeting them only at the higher slug density patches whilst leaving the rest untreated and still retain adequate control measures. The approaches we've been using are fairly straightforward, and some of the steps are illustrated on this slide. For example, we started by saying, well, actually, do patches occur in all fields? Because if they don't, then we're probably onto a loser in the first place and could give up. We found they were, and then went on to look at the spatiotemporal stability of the patches. Do they move around within the growing season and within the control window? If they do, again, we would be onto a loser, but they seem to be very stable. Patch size was important because that determines whether we can automate targeting with pelleters. The patch frequency in combination with patch size was important because that determined the area treated, and the area treated determines the savings, again, in pesticide application, again indicating whether it was worth proceeding with the work. All these came out fairly well, and we're now at one of our later stages of how on earth do you locate in advance, predict the location of the patches. And to do this, we've been doing over the last couple of years a final piece of work in which we're using and trying to develop a series of or a combination of a suite of soil characteristics which will accurately predict where these slug patches are going to exist. So the biology is reasonably well advanced now, but to achieve a commercially viable outcome, we had to incorporate industry knowledge. And way back at the beginning, when we were thinking of this worried us. There were, for example, when we thought about it, a lot of specialist areas which had to be incorporated and consulted in order to get this work right. And that meant multiple stakeholders, all of which with different perceptions. We couldn't get around this because the trust of the industry would rely on us having proper advice and expertise involved in the project from the start. And therefore, we needed to find a way of consulting all these people, but also doing it in a cost-effective fashion. What we did in the end was segment the specialist areas into groups with similar perceptions and interests in the work we were doing, and then select from those the key or one or two key players, companies or individuals, who could then work with us on an almost day-to-day or week-by-week basis as we were developing our techniques and developing the research findings. So, for example, one segment was the technology, everything from soil mapping all the way through to the pelleter manufacturers. And there we were exploring whether we needed new technology, which would be a problem in uptake, or whether indeed we were simply looking at new applications of old technology, perhaps with a few modifications, hopefully without. These groups also brought with them a degree of commercial acumen. We had to recognize that what we were doing was not simply a piece of interesting biology or a biological problem, but in fact, the ultimate aim was to produce a tool for business. And therefore, we had to make sure that that tool was commercially realistic, or it wouldn't be taken up. Again, we needed detailed advice and guidance from the industry and various sectors of the industry to do this. End user understanding and perspective, their perspective on our concepts also was important. because otherwise the work wouldn't be accepted and therefore wouldn't be taken up and applied. So again, the concerns and the risks associated with what we were doing had to be fully understood by us and therefore had to be defined by the industry sectors themselves. And as part of all this, whilst doing this interaction with industry, we hoped would build a profile of the work, so there was a wider appreciation developing on an ongoing basis of what we were doing, and along with that, expectation management. Too often we find people expecting you to deliver more than is actually possible and probably more than is needed. And therefore we needed to have our targets very clearly understood. What became very apparent during the project is not surprising, and that is this had to be a continuous interaction. We couldn't just go and speak once or twice to each segment of the industry. We had to bring them in at the planning stage, so we got our focus exactly correct. And we had to then continually interact with them in an iterative fashion during the whole of the project delivery. And this interaction also had to be a two-way interaction. It wasn't just information being sought and coming back to us, but we had to discuss also how we use that information, how it was important in developing our concepts, and critically also how to design the work in order to explore relevant factors. Once we'd done the work, we would then go back to each relevant industry sector with the output. We would discuss it, discuss what it meant, and then decide on what the next steps were. And in this way, it became apparent over the years that instead of just being a source of information, in fact, many of these sectors and many of these participants voluntarily became part and parcel of the project delivery, and it became a shared project. Now then, what are the specialist segments we looked at? Well, there were many of them, and here's a couple of examples. In the technology section, for example, there were four main areas we were interested in. One was techniques for automated soil assessment and soil mapping software. There was the application technology was important. GPS manufacturers were consulted, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, pelleter manufacturers. And the approaches we adopted tended to evolve to more or less a similar approach in each case. We started with direct face-to-face discussions in the days before COVID when we could do that. We then moved on to more frequent virtual discussions via the internet, which allowed us a greater frequency without having to travel. Sometimes this resulted in it becoming appropriate to go out to the fields to discuss various issues on real field visits. That seemed to stimulate ideas. And at times also in one or two cases, for example, with the soil assessment and mapping software, it was clear that we as biologists and researchers needed a greater understanding of how this technology worked in order to understand how it could be used. And indeed, one of our contacts, Precision Decisions, voluntarily gave us free of charge training workshops to bring us up to speed. And so gradually, from an initial just approach and question and answer discussion, we evolved over the years in a lot of these cases to direct participation of the relevant companies in our research. And that has been absolutely invaluable in taking it forward. When we came to the agronomists and farmers, without going into detail with an eye on the watch already, they had a rather different point of view, and we had accordingly different interests, and we had different methods of dealing with them. And one lesson which came out was the approach to be adopted had to be tailored to the interest, perspectives, and the information that was being transmitted and shared by each of these segments. I won't labour this one, but here are just a few examples of the stakeholders who we consulted on a regular basis on some of the segments. And I'll just use Precision Decisions, the soil mapping and soil assessment company, as an example of what we did. Precision Decisions broadly started off by giving us a lot of advice and information, and ultimately became critically important in giving us practical assistance, as you'll find out in a minute. Initially, we approached them because we wanted to know what soil characteristics were currently being mapped and used commercially by farmers. We started off receiving a lot of detailed information from Precision Decisions, which answered that question, but also provided other information and perspectives of things which we were in danger of missing and therefore needed to be taken into consideration in the work we were doing. This moved on to discussions of soil sampling methods and EC scanning machinery. And then ultimately, we started looking at the soil characteristics which were currently used commercially and whether indeed these could be, this information could be also used in order to define where our, could also be used to predict the locations of our patches which we wanted to target with pesticides. The idea of this was important because if you had to go out and soil scan for slugs alone, it would be expensive, possibly not cost effective, and even if it was, it would deter uptake. If you can share the use of soil scans taken for other purposes, then it was far more likely that we could utilize this approach to locate our patches. To look at this, we then looked at various aspects: assessment timing, did it relate well to our needs? The frequency of resampling, we knew some of the soil characteristics we were interested in were fairly stable in their variability across the field, but they did drift with time. So was the sampling done frequently enough for our purposes? And some interesting points arose. Distance between sampling points became important. We had begun to become clear on the sizes of these little patches which we were targeting. And if the the assessments were taken at different points across the field which were too far apart, then there was a chance that the patches, some of them would fall between those sampling points and be missed. And therefore, it was very important to make sure that the definition was high enough in the assessment maps for our purposes. As I mentioned earlier, training for current online systems and transferability of mapping software was provided, and they also gave us a lot of information about how to accurately interpret soil scans. I think the next element is of particular importance, because as the company became more interested in what we were doing and more confident in what we were doing, they started to volunteer practical assistance. Initially as introductions to industry contacts, which allowed us to find more field sites over a larger geographical range to make sure our experimental work was not affected by the geographical location in which we did it. And ultimately, they started offering bespoke soil mapping for our experimental fields, and in order to allow us to look at the application of the real commercial technique and whether it worked for our predictions of patch locations, slug patch locations. We moved on then to look at the variation in soil maps across rotations, and that in itself became interesting because we were planned to take repeated samples in our experimental sites. However, pandemic then caught us out in that the soil resampling issue became a problem. We were stopped from traveling to our field sites, and therefore our manual soil samples were not, couldn't be taken. And at that point, the patch location work was about to really collapse. Precision Decisions managed to save the day by offering us their historical assessment data from fields in which soil maps had been produced for up to 4 consecutive years, giving us a fine, adequate data set which we could go forward with. I won't go into detail on this one. The industry sector, agronomists and farmers came up with a lot of very different advice and information. And here, one of the critical elements was whether the risks associated with losing control of slugs in this area were adequately addressed by the techniques we were developing. And so moving on to the final section of the talk, what were the project responses to these different pieces of advice? Well, in yellow, I've got some of the steps which we had dealt with, which I introduced on the first slide, which we have already been completed doing. And each of them was in fact, modified, the way we investigated them was modified as a result of industry advice. So do patches occur in the field, and the size and frequency of patches? The design of the trial system which we employed was critically affected by the soil assessment constraints which were imposed by the techniques that are used commercially, ensuring that commercial samples were going to be an accurate predictor of soil location. We had thought of looking at the spatio-temporal stability of the patches, but what we hadn't realized was that the farmers were particularly concerned about the patches the movement of slugs from these patches outwards, actually causing reinfection to occur more quickly after a partial treatment of the field. And so we looked at a completely new piece of work, which we hadn't originally planned, looking at the biological mechanisms of the slug behavior, which cause the cohesion and stability of the patches. And so on. There are a large number of areas in which this kind of modification, critical modification, to insert commercial reality into the biological investigations was valuable. I'm beginning to run out of time, I think, looking at the clock, and so I'll move on to the conclusion side. Overall, whilst delivering this work, several key messages have come out, amongst which are the following. Ownership of the project outcomes is very important if the work is going to be taken up. And the real owners are not the biologists who have developed and helped produce the system, but the industry themselves. As a result, it is vitally important that right at the beginning of the project and throughout the delivery of the work, we identify the real requirements and concerns of the industry. Consultations should be started before the first piece of practical work and should be undertaken on an iterative method so that all opinions are taken into account as the systems we're developing progress. We've got to design the work to achieve that, of course, to meet the scientific objectives, but that's not sufficient. Incorporating industry constraints, requirements, and current practices are also of critical importance, and all must be incorporated into the design of the approaches we use. Recognition of risk, I mentioned earlier. There are many aspects which will concern the end users in terms when you introduce a new system of pest control, all of which will have associated risks, and all of those risks must be addressed. You cannot have a situation where the system falls down, because that then could have catastrophic effects on the business which is operating it. Now, biologists are, of course, not good at identifying these risks in general. Most of us have a particular skill set, a research skill set, but have never grown a commercial crop in our life. And therefore, the understanding of industry is fundamental in determining what is in reality feasible, and science merely delivers within these constraints. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it extends what is thought to be possible, but nonetheless, that must be done within the perceived constraints of industry. Which brings us on to who designs the work. Design, of course, is fundamental to providing reliable output that promotes the provision of correct and reliable information. But who should be involved with that design? How should it be done? And to explain this, my mind goes back to some training I did in the days many years ago when I was interested in developing computerized systems for use on farm. And there I was taught that a systems analyst, a good system analyst should not take a brief from the client and then design the system and code the program to meet that brief, but should instead discuss the problems and issues relating to what the client wants done, and then gather the appropriate information by which to develop the system. In short, what I'm saying, the systems analysts should try and draw out from the client exactly the design of the work or of the product that they want. The client, therefore, without realizing it, actually does the design themselves. And to some extent, that's important in this kind of work. So that's the mantra. Did we follow it? How did it turn out? Now, this is a busy slide and I have no intention of going through it. It's my last slide, but you'll recognize that in the middle here are the steps which I introduced to which we followed in this work on my first slide. In black, we have the areas in which, or some of the areas, not all, in which changes to the approach, or indeed in some cases, complete new elements were introduced to the approach, entirely as a result of the interaction with the various business sectors. I think it's quite humbling as a researcher to see that so much needed to be added in order to make sure that what we were doing with the biology was actually meaningful in a commercial field. I would finish, if any of them are online at the moment, by thanking all the contributors from industry. It has all been done free of charge. They've been very generous with their time and their materials, and without it, we wouldn't have made the fast progress which we already have. I'd also thank everybody for putting up with my first online talk, and I hope it came over reasonably okay, Neil. Thank you.